It started with a knock. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure, the kind you feel in your back molars before a storm rolls in, a vibration that lives just below the threshold of hearing. Mara Voss noticed it first on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after she'd stopped sleeping. She was sitting in front of her monitors at 2:14 in the morning, the apartment dark except for the blue wash of 5 screens, a half-eaten sleeve of crackers going stale beside the keyboard, and she felt it. A resonance. A frequency that didn't belong to any device she owned. She turned around. The room was empty. The bathroom door was open, and the mirror above the sink caught the light from her screens and gave it back distorted, teal and cold. She turned back to her work. She was a signals analyst for a private infrastructure firm, which meant she spent most of her waking hours looking for anomalies in satellite data that nobody else would bother reading. It was solitary work, precise work, the kind of work that suited a person who had stopped trusting the warmth of other people and found a better, cleaner warmth in numbers. The knock came again 3 nights later. This time she heard it with her ears. It was like someone standing just on the other side of a wall and pressing their palm flat against it. Not aggressive, not afraid, patient. The sound of something that had been waiting long enough that patience had become its natural state. Mara got up from her desk. She walked through the apartment with a methodical calm that she recognized, even as it was happening, as the calm of someone who had already decided not to be frightened. She checked the front door, locked. She checked the windows, sealed. She checked the bathroom last because the bathroom mirror had been bothering her for days, not in any way she could name, just the sense that something on the other side of the glass was slightly wrong, off by a degree, misaligned. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself for a long time. Her own face looked back, tired, angular, a smear of old mascara under her left eye. 31 years old and already wearing the specific exhaustion of someone who had spent too long staring at data that no one else thought mattered. Then the reflection blinked. She had not blinked. Mara Voss stood very still in her bathroom at 2:47 in the morning, and she watched the version of herself inside the mirror finish the blink, slowly, and then look at her with an expression she did not have. An expression of profound and specific relief, the way a person looks when they've been called on after years of raising their hand. She said out loud to no one and nothing, "Come in." She didn't know why she said it. She would spend a great deal of time afterward trying to understand the instinct. The closest she ever got was this: she had spent her entire professional life looking for signals in static. She had learned, through 10 years of practice and 2 advanced degrees and more sleepless nights than she could count, that the difference between noise and signal was not loudness. It was not clarity. It was pattern. It was repetition. It was the sense that something was trying specifically to be understood. Whatever was in her mirror had been trying. She could feel that. The knocking, the resonance, the slight wrongness in the glass, it wasn't chaos. It was code. She said, "Come in," and the mirror rippled. Not dramatically, not with light or sound or any of the theater she would have expected from something that was, she would later confirm, a first contact event between the human species and an intelligence that had traveled 400 light years to knock on her bathroom mirror. It rippled the way water ripples when you set something gently on its surface. A slow, concentric widening that started at the center of the glass and moved outward and then was still. And then the mirror showed her something that was not her apartment. It showed her a vessel, a ship so large that scale was meaningless at first. It took her a long moment to find something she could use as a reference point, and when she did, when she identified what she was looking at as approximately the size of a small moon rendered in a material she had no name for, dark and latticed and patient, she sat down on the bathroom floor because her knees had decided the rest of her was on her own. The vessel was not moving. It was parked, in the way that something parks when it is very old and very experienced and has learned that arriving loudly accomplishes nothing. It was in the outer solar system, past the orbit of Neptune, and it had been there. The mirror was showing her this somehow, in a way she could feel more than read for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. It had been knocking for 2 years. No one had answered. Mara sat on her bathroom tile, which was cold and slightly gritty from a week of not mopping, and she looked at the ship in her mirror, and she thought about the knock. The patient, careful, specific knock of something that understood, on a level she couldn't quite articulate, that the worst thing you can do when you arrive somewhere new is frighten the people who live there. "How many?" she said into the mirror. The glass showed her a number that she understood as a feeling rather than a figure. Many. The ship was not empty. "What do you want?" The mirror showed her something that took several minutes to resolve into meaning. A long, winding image of distance, of cold space, of something she interpreted as tiredness. Not the tiredness of a body that needed rest, but the tiredness of a journey so long that the destination had become more concept than place. They had been traveling for a very long time. They had come from very far away. And they had something. The mirror showed her this slowly, carefully, as though afraid of how it might land. They had something they needed to give. Not trade, not share, give. Mara pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, where the pressure of the frequency had been sitting for weeks, and she felt at ease for the first time since it started. "Okay," she said. She got up off the floor. She went to her desk. She opened a new file and began to write, because Mara Voss was, before anything else, a scientist, and scientists write things down. The first call she made was to her former dissertation advisor, a physicist named Cho who had retired to a farmhouse in Vermont and spent most of his time now growing heirloom tomatoes and writing letters to journals that no longer accepted paper correspondence. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. She told him what had happened. There was a long silence. "Show me," he said. She pointed her phone at the bathroom mirror. The mirror obligingly showed him the ship. Another long silence. "Mara," he said. "I know. That's not in any of the databases. That's not any known orbital object. I know. It's enormous. I know. How long have you?" 3 weeks, but it's been there for 2 years. She heard him set down whatever he'd been holding. She heard him breathe. She recognized the sound. It was the sound of a man recalibrating, the sound of a mind that had spent 60 years building a model of the universe, discovering that the model had a gap. "What does it want?" Cho said. "To give us something. That's what it's shown me. I don't know what yet. And you just said come in. What would you have done?" Another silence, then quietly the same thing. Cho drove through the night and arrived at her apartment at dawn, smelling of truck stop coffee and wearing a coat he'd had since 1987. He stood in front of the mirror for 45 minutes without speaking. Mara sat at her desk and let him have the silence. She understood from her own experience with the mirror that the communication didn't work on anyone else's timeline. You had to wait. You had to be willing to just sit in the uncertainty of it, and not demand that it resolve faster than it was capable of resolving. When Cho finally turned around, his face had the expression she'd seen on her reflection that first night. Relief, and something older than relief. The specific emotion of a person who had spent their entire life asking a question and had just been told that the question was real. "We need more people," he said. "I know. Carefully. Obviously. Not the government, not yet." Mara had already made a list. She handed it to him. He read it and nodded at 3 of the names and questioned 2 and flatly refused 1. "Hargrove is a leak," he said. "Hargrove is the best xenolinguist alive. Hargrove is a leak who will call his brother at the NSA before you finish your first sentence." Mara crossed off the name. "Fine, who else speaks to things that aren't human?" Cho thought about it. Kessler, University of Edinburgh. She does computational pattern work on deep-sea communication. Cephalopod cognition mostly. You think cephalopod cognition translates to? Mara gestured at the mirror. I think someone who has spent 20 years learning to think like something that uses 8 independent semi-brains to process a single thought is better equipped for this than anyone who has spent their career assuming that intelligence looks like us. Mara added Kessler to the list. They called her that afternoon. Dr. Sienna Kessler was 44, Scottish, and had the manner of someone who had been mildly skeptical of everyone and everything since approximately age 9. She listened to Mara's account without interrupting. When Mara was done, Kessler said, "Describe the knocking sound again." Mara described it. "Pressure differential," Kessler said. "They're compressing the signal envelope before transmission. That's a control mechanism. They're keeping it small on purpose, keeping it quiet. They don't want to startle anyone." "Does that tell you anything about them?" "It tells me they've done this before," Kessler said. "It tells me they've gotten it wrong before, arrived somewhere and frightened the residents, and they learned from it." A pause. "I'll be on the first train to London. I can get a flight from there." The group grew slowly, quietly over the next 2 weeks. 7 people finally. Mara, Cho, Kessler, a materials scientist named Adiz who worked for a nanotechnology firm in Lagos, an astrophysicist from Bangalore named Rajan who specialized in unidentified gravitational signatures, a linguist from Buenos Aires named Tors who had spent her career on constructed languages and communication theory, and a 17-year-old named Ben who had been tracking the anomalous gravitational data from the outer solar system on a home-built telescope array in his parents' backyard in rural Ohio, and had emailed Rajan about it 6 months ago and been politely ignored, and had emailed again last month, and had been politely ignored again, and had shown up, finally, in person, at Rajan's university office with a folder of printed data. And Rajan had looked at the data and gone pale. Ben was not a scientist yet. He was a kid who hadn't slept properly in 2 years because the numbers wouldn't leave him alone. Mara recognized the condition. They set up in her apartment, 7 people in a 2-bedroom flat with an excess of laptops and a whiteboard that Cho bought at an office supply store down the street, and that Tors immediately covered in diagrams that no one else fully understood. The mirror became the focal point of every day. Each person spent time in front of it, alone. Each person came out with something different. An image, a feeling, an impression of vast patience and careful restraint, and the specific quality of attention that a very old, very thoughtful thing gives when it is looking at something small and new and trying not to break it. "Their mothers," Ben said on the 3rd day. Everyone looked at him. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his notebook, which was covered in his cramped, hurried handwriting. He looked up. "I know that sounds, I know. But the signal pattern, the way the knock wraps around itself, the way the frequency brackets the transmission, it's nurturing behavior. It's the pattern of something that is trying to protect the thing it's communicating with from the impact of the communication itself." Like, he searched for words. Like how you talk to a kid who'd just seen something scary. You'd lower your voice. You'd round the edges off everything. You'd come in small. Tors set down her pen. "He's right." "They have a name for themselves," Kessler said from the bathroom doorway. She'd spent the last 3 hours in front of the mirror. Her eyes were red at the edges. "I can't render it in sound yet, but I can tell you what it means. I can tell you the concept. It translates roughly as those who carry the record." Silence. "What record?" Cho said. Kessler sat down on the arm of the couch. "Theirs, everyone's. Every species they've encountered, every intelligence in the galaxy that has let them in." She rubbed her eyes. "They're not conquerors. They're not missionaries. They're their archivists. They travel from inhabited system to inhabited system, and they offer an exchange. They take a complete record of everything you are, your language, your history, your biology, your music, the specific way your species holds grief, and they carry it. They add it to what they carry, and in return, they give you access to the record of every species that has ever agreed to the same exchange. The apartment was very quiet. "How many species?" Adiz said. Kessler looked at her. "I couldn't count them. When I asked the mirror to show me, it showed me something that felt like counting stars." Mara was standing by the window. She had her back to the room. Outside, the city was doing what cities do: traffic and voices and the smell of rain on warm pavement. She pressed her forehead against the glass and felt the cool of it and thought about 2 years of knocking. 2 years of a vast ship sitting in the cold dark past Neptune, patient as geology, knocking softly on a door that no one had thought to answer. Not because humanity was hostile, not because they were afraid, because no one had been listening at the right frequency. "What does the record look like?" Tors said. "The thing they'd give us, what form does it take?" Kessler was quiet for a moment. "They showed me something like a library, but it wasn't shelves and books. It was more like, have you ever been in a place where everyone around you is speaking a language you don't know, but you can feel the intent of the conversation anyway? The emotion underneath the words. It was like that, but for everything, for whole species. You wouldn't just know their history, you'd feel it." Ben had stopped writing in his notebook. He was staring at the floor with the expression of someone who had been handed something so large they didn't know where to hold it. "They've been trying for 2 years, Mara said, without turning from the window. "That's what gets me. They didn't push harder. They didn't escalate. They just kept knocking at the same frequency, patient as anything, and waited." "What do you think they've encountered before?" Rajan said. "Civilizations that didn't answer." "Or that answered badly," Tors said quietly. "Answered with weapons, answered with panic, answered in ways that made both sides worse for it." "That would explain the control mechanism," Kessler said. "Coming in small, coming in gentle, they've had bad arrivals before, they've learned." Cho was standing by the whiteboard reading Tors' diagrams. Without looking up, he said, "What do we do?" Mara turned from the window. 7 people were looking at her, which was not a thing she'd been prepared for, but then she was the one who'd said come in. She'd been the one at the door. "We invite them properly," she said. The mechanics of proper invitation took another week to work out. The mirror, the interface, was stable enough for impression and image. It wasn't sufficient for the kind of structured exchange that what they were proposing required. Tors and Kessler worked on it together, taking turns in front of the glass, building a vocabulary brick by brick. A shared symbol for yes, a shared symbol for understood, a shared symbol for wait. Basic grammar. The kind of stripped-down communicative armature that humans build with toddlers, and that turns out to be, Tors observed, structurally similar to how you'd communicate with anyone whose cognitive architecture you don't fully understand yet. "The key is not to assume," Tors said, on the 4th night, eating cold delivery food and annotating a diagram at the same time. Every xenolinguistic first contact disaster in science fiction fails because one party assumes the other party means what they mean. You can't. You have to let meaning emerge. You have to be patient enough for something genuinely new to take shape. "How patient?" Ben said. "Longer than feels comfortable." Tors smiled briefly. "Longer than any of us were trained for." Ben nodded. He was getting better at sitting with uncertainty. Mara watched him practice it and thought about herself at 17, which had been a person who could not sit still, who demanded that things resolve faster than they wanted to. She thought about the version of herself that would have encountered the knocking, and concluded it was a problem to be solved rather than an invitation to be accepted. She was glad she had grown past that version. She hoped she'd grown past it in time. On the 6th day, Tors and Kessler together built something in the mirror that was not quite a sentence and not quite a gesture but functioned as both. A reciprocal acknowledgement. "We see you. We heard you. We are here." The mirror showed them the ship again. And this time, for the first time, the ship moved. Not toward them. Not yet. It moved the way someone moves when they've been sitting very still for a very long time and they finally allow themselves to shift their weight. A small adjustment, a settling, the specific movement of something that has been holding itself carefully in check and has just been given permission to breathe. Adiz, who was watching from the doorway, said very quietly, "Oh." Just that, but everyone in the apartment understood. Rajan picked up his phone and called an observatory contact in Chile who owed him a favor and asked her to take a quiet, unofficial look at the outer solar system. She called back 40 minutes later, her voice absolutely level in the way that voices go absolutely level when the alternative is screaming. "There's something out past Neptune," she said. "Rajan, there's something very large out past Neptune." "I know," he said. "It just moved." "I know." "Should I?" "Not yet," he said. "Give us a little more time." She was quiet for a moment. How much time? "Enough to do this right." Another silence. Then carefully, "Okay." The communication deepened over the following days. The mothers, none of them used any other name for the visitors now. Ben had named them and the name had stuck with the ease of a right thing, were systematic. They didn't rush. They offered information in pieces that were sized for human comprehension, and when something was too large or too strange, they would pull back and approach it from a different angle, find a different way in, try again. They were, Kessler noted, extraordinary communicators. Not because they were powerful or sophisticated, though they were both, but because they cared about being understood. They cared about the experience of the person on the other side of the glass. "They've made mistakes," she told the group one evening. "I can feel that in the way they communicate. There's a care in it that comes from loss, like someone who learned to be gentle by not being gentle once and carrying it." "What kind of mistakes?" Cho said. "I don't know. Maybe we'll find out. Maybe that's part of what they carry, a record of the times it went wrong." Tors looked up from her notes. "That would make them better than most species, honestly. Most species erase the record of their failures." Myra thought about that for a while. On the 9th day, the mothers showed her the record. She was alone in the bathroom, which was where she always went when she needed to be alone with the mirror, and she was standing in front of the glass, and she asked, not in words, but in the shaped intention they'd been building together, she asked to understand what was being offered. The mirror opened. It didn't break or shatter. It didn't glow or produce dramatic light. It simply became, for a moment, permeable, the surface of it thinning like ice in spring, until it was not quite solid and not quite absent. And through it she received something that would take her 3 years to describe fully and that she would never describe completely. It was not like reading. It was not like watching a film. It was more like, she would say this in every interview, in every paper, in every conversation for the rest of her life. It was more like remembering something you had never experienced. The way grief for a stranger can feel real and immediate because grief is grief, and the specific language of it doesn't require translation. She received, in the space of perhaps 10 minutes, the impression of 17,000 years of accumulated civilizational record. Not the details, not the specifics, but the shape of it, the texture, the emotional architecture, the understanding that the universe was full of things that had learned to think and speak and love and lose, and that most of them had, at some point, been afraid in the dark and reached out for something and found it. When she came back to herself, she was sitting on the bathroom floor again. The tiles were cold and gritty. She hadn't mopped. She decided she would mop more. She got up and walked into the main room, where 6 people were sitting in various states of fatigue and concentration, and the particular brightness that comes from being inside something momentous, and she said, "We need to talk about what comes next." What came next was the hardest part. Because the mothers had been patient, and Mara's small group had answered, and the exchange was real and it was genuine, and everything they had hoped and more. But the planet had 7 billion other people on it. And those people had governments. And those governments had threat assessment protocols. And 7 people in a London flat deciding on behalf of 8 billion was exactly the kind of thing that could go wrong in slow, grinding, institutional ways that would outlast all of them. They talked about it for 2 days straight. Mara slept for 4 hours in the middle of it and woke up to find Ben had covered the second whiteboard in a decision. Tree and Tors was arguing with Rajan about disclosure velocity. And Cho had made a pot of tea that no one had drunk and was staring at it with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to know that most good things get complicated before they get good again. "We go public," Mara said on the second morning. Everyone looked at her. "Not the governments first, not the agencies. We go to the public. We show them what we've shown each other. We let people come to it the way I came to it, one person, standing in front of something real, being given the time to understand it." "That's not how disclosure works," Rajan said. "That's not how it's worked before," Mara said. "This is different. They didn't knock on the door of the UN. They knocked on a bathroom mirror in a flat in London at 2 in the morning. They chose that. They chose small. They chose patient. I think we should honor what they chose." Cho wrapped both hands around his cold tea. "It'll be messy. Yes. People will be frightened. Some people are frightened of everything. But most people aren't. Most people are just waiting for the thing that makes the world larger than they thought it was." Kessler looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, how do we do it?" They built the broadcast over the next 4 days. Rajan connected with his observatory contact in Chile, who had by now told her own circle of trusted colleagues, who had told theirs, in the way that genuine and verifiable wonder travels, not like rumor, which spreads because it's exciting, but like certainty, which spreads because the person telling you has looked at it with their own eyes and knows. A network assembled itself around them, quietly, without announcement. Astronomers and physicists and signal analysts and one marine biologist who had been tracking the gravitational anomaly independently and had already written a draft paper that he'd been afraid to submit. They released everything at once, all the data, all the recordings, the mirror, the ship. The communication log that Tors and Kessler had built together, translated into 43 languages overnight by a volunteer network of linguists who joined the effort within hours of the initial release. Video of each member of the group, standing in front of the mirror, describing what they'd experienced. Ben's data from the Ohio Backyard Telescope, which turned out to be, Rajan admitted with a chagrined laugh, more complete than the data from 3 professional observatories. And the message from the mothers, which they had asked permission to share, and which the mothers had given, a single sustained frequency broadcast invisible light across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, for a full hour, patient and unambiguous and warm, the specific warmth of something that has been waiting a very long time to be welcomed and has just been told, "Come in." The response from the world was not what Mara had been afraid of. It was not panic mostly. It was not the government shutdown or the social collapse or the defensive military posture that the worst of her nightmares had produced. It was mostly the sound of 7 billion people breathing out. It was the specific exhale of a species that had been, without quite knowing it, holding its breath, afraid of the dark, afraid of the silence, afraid that the universe was vast and empty and that they were alone in it, being told at last, "You are not alone. You never were. Here is the record. Here is everyone who came before you. Here is the proof that intelligence is not the exception. It is the rule." There were governments that reacted badly. Of course there were. There were military assets scrambled toward the outer solar system, and there were emergency sessions, and there were broadcasts demanding to know who had authorized this, who was in charge, who had given 7 civilians the right to speak for humanity. Mara gave a press conference. She was terrible at press conferences. She stood in front of 200 cameras with her hair not quite right and her voice a little hoarse from 48 hours without sleep, and she said, "Nobody authorized it. I was alone in my apartment at 2 in the morning and something knocked on my mirror and I said, 'Come in.' That's the whole story. I don't have any authority over 8 billion people. I just happen to be the one standing in front of the door." Someone in the back asked, "Are you scared?" Mara thought about it. "I was scared of the silence before they came. I'm not scared now." The mothers did not move from their position, past Neptune for another 3 months. They were waiting, Kessler understood, for a consensus. Not a formal one, not a vote or a declaration or a treaty, but the kind of consensus that forms when enough people have had time to look at something and decide how they feel about it. The kind of consensus that cannot be forced or scheduled. The kind that has to grow. During those 3 months, the mirror remained active. The group in Mara's apartment fielded questions, not officially, not as a committee, but because they were there and reachable and people needed to ask someone. Scientists from 30 countries sent requests for data. Children sent drawings, which was something nobody had anticipated. Ben took charge of the drawings, which he seemed to find important in a way he couldn't explain and didn't try to. He pinned them on the wall of the second bedroom, which had become his room by a slow process of occupation, and sometimes he would stand in front of them for a while in the early morning before anyone else was awake. Mara asked him about it once. He said, "They should see these, the mothers, when they come." "You think they'll want to?" "They've been carrying 17,000 years of everyone else's records," Ben said. "That's what they are. Of course, they'll want to see what we made." Mara thought about a child in Mumbai who had drawn the ship, purple and enormous, with a small blue earth below it and a dotted line of communication between them, and the word hello written in the careful capital letters of someone who was very young and very certain that being polite was the right approach. She thought about that child, who had never heard the knock, who had never stood in front of any mirror at any hour, but who had received the news and understood it in the way that the young understand enormous things, fully, without the need to reconcile it against a pre-existing model, because the model was still being built. "Yeah," she said, "they will." The approach took 3 months. The mothers came in slowly, measurably, in a trajectory that every amateur astronomer on Earth was tracking within a week. They didn't attempt to hide themselves. They had been hidden, quietly, patiently, for 2 years, and it had gotten them nowhere. Now they came openly, and the openness was its own message. "We trust you with our visibility." The ship was extraordinary. Even in the early telescope data, even before it was close enough to resolve into detail, it had the quality of something made with great care over enormous time. Not sleek, not aggressive, not built for the performance of power. It was built for endurance and for carrying. The materials that Adiz identified, she would spend the next decade publishing on them, were engineered for the preservation of information at the molecular scale. The entire structure was, in one sense, an archive, a record of its own making. When it reached the inner solar system, the governments of the world had, by a process of negotiation that was ugly and slow, and that Mara was grateful she was not personally involved in, agreed on a framework. Not a welcome exactly, not an agreement, a framework. A structure for ongoing communication, with Mara's group serving as the initial interlocutors, with the explicit understanding that this role would eventually expand and formalize, and that the small apartment in London was not meant to be the permanent reception hall for a galaxy-wide archive. Mara was fine with that. She'd never wanted to be in charge of anything. She'd wanted to understand things. She was beginning to understand, slowly, that understanding was its own kind of leadership, not the kind that stood at podiums and issued directives, but the kind that stood at mirrors at 3 in the morning and listened. The first formal exchange took place aboard the mother's ship, in a chamber that the mothers had designed for the purpose, calibrated to human sensory range, lit in spectra that eyes could process, aired with compounds that human lungs could manage. It was the evidence of extensive preparation, of years of quiet observation and careful study before the knocking had even begun. Mara went first. She sat in a chair. They had made a chair, which she found inexplicably moving. The thought of these beings studying human chairs, and across from her, was a presence that was not human in any physical sense, and was not performing humanity in any false sense. And the two of them sat together for a long while in the comfortable silence of things that have learned, slowly, at cost, to wait for meaning rather than demand it. They communicated for 4 hours. When she came out, she was crying, which was embarrassing, but everyone who entered that chamber cried eventually. Even Rajan, who had told her privately that he hadn't cried since 2019. Even Cho, who cried and then laughed and then sat down heavily and said nothing for 20 minutes, staring at his hands like they were someone else's. What had been given to them was not power, not technology, though the technology would eventually follow, offered carefully, in pieces sized for absorption rather than overwhelm. What had been given was weight, the specific and irreversible weight of knowing that everything humans had ever made, every song, every theorem, every bad decision, every act of grace, every year of accumulated ordinary beauty had been seen, was being kept, was part of something larger than a single species run at consciousness in one small corner of an unremarkable galaxy. It was the weight of being known. Mara understood in the days after that this was what the knocking had been, not an alarm, not a demand, not even exactly a greeting. It had been the sound of something saying, "I see you. I know you're there, take your time." It had been the sound of something that had learned, from what losses she didn't fully know yet, in what specific dark years of arriving somewhere wrong, that the only way to meet a new intelligence is the way you'd meet anyone who mattered. Carefully, patiently, with both hands visible, and no assumption that the door would open on your timeline. She had been the one to open it. She hadn't planned to. She'd been awake at 2 in the morning, in a bathroom with unmopped tiles, tired in the specific way of someone who had been doing solitary, precise work for too long, and something had knocked, and she had recognized a pattern in the knocking, and she had said, "Come in." It was not heroism. She was clear about that in every telling for the rest of her long life. It was not courage, exactly. It was the accumulated habit of a decade of looking for signal in static, the trained instinct that refused to call something noise until it had been listened to completely. The mothers, when she asked them, much later, why her? Why a signals analyst in a London flat? Why a bathroom mirror? Why 2 in the morning? Showed her something in the glass that she interpreted as a shrug and a smile, the universal gesture of something that had navigated enough of the cosmos to know that the answer to why is almost always, because someone was listening. In the years that followed, the world changed the way all genuine things change, slowly, then all at once, and then slowly again as people and institutions and the accumulated weight of a species' habits and fears and hopes adjusted to a new shape of things. It was not easy. Ease was not the point. The mothers had never promised ease. They had offered company and record and the irreversible expansion of the frame, and they had delivered on every count. Ben grew up and became a xenocommunication specialist, which was a profession that did not exist until the year after the first exchange, in which he was, by most assessments, the best in the world at. He kept the children's drawings. He had them scanned and added to the formal record exchange, which the mothers received with what he interpreted as the kind of delight that does not require expression because it is complete. Kessler wrote the foundational paper on mother communication architecture, which became the basis for every subsequent contact protocol, and spent 20 years teaching it to people who would spend their careers building on it and arguing with it, and getting it wrong and trying again. Torres documented the language, or rather, the meta-language, the framework beneath the framework, the communicative principles that the mothers used not because they were uniquely their own, but because they were, she argued, the universal grammar that any sufficiently old and sufficiently humbled intelligence eventually arrives at. She called it, in the paper, the grammar of patience. It was the most downloaded academic paper of the century. Adiz built a career that lasted 40 years on the material science of the mother's ship, and in the process developed 3 new fields and 2 new manufacturing techniques, the second of which became the basis for the long-duration deep space vessels that humans would eventually build, slowly, carefully, to begin their own long outward movement. Rajan admitted, in a recorded interview, that Ben had been right about the gravitational data, and he had been wrong to ignore the emails, and that he tried to think about that when his own graduate students came to him with things that didn't fit the model. Cho tended his tomatoes and lived to be 97, and came back to the mirror once more near the end, and spent a long time in front of it, and came out looking the way he'd looked when he first drove down from Vermont in the dark, recalibrated, larger somehow, in a way that didn't require more space. And Mara remained the one who answered. Not exclusively, not officially, but in the way that a person who opens a door becomes, in some private and uncontractable sense, the doorkeeper. She worked with the formal contact teams and the intergovernmental bodies and the inevitable bureaucratic structures that formed around something as enormous as first contact with an ancient species bearing the accumulated record of 10,000 civilizations. She was patient with the bureaucracy. She was patient with the people who were afraid. She was patient with the ones who wanted to claim credit and the ones who wanted to assign blame and the ones who asked, still, years later, who had authorized her. She had not been authorized. She had been awake at 2 in the morning listening. That was enough. It had always been enough. On the wall of her apartment she kept one of the children's drawings, not the Mumbai child, though she loved that one too. This was a drawing from a 6-year-old in Nairobi who had drawn herself, large and small at the same time in the way of children's drawings, standing in front of a huge dark shape, and between the child and the shape was a line of light, and the child's hand was extended, and the caption, written in an adult's hand at the child's direction, read, "She said hello and they said hello back." It wasn't exactly how it had happened. Mara hadn't said hello, she'd said come in. But she understood the drawing. She understood it the way she understood the knock, not through language, but through the shape of the feeling underneath. Something was out there. It saw them. It had been patient enough to wait until someone was listening. And someone had been. There were moments, in the years that followed, when Mara would think about what the world had almost done. Not with bitterness. She was not, by nature, a person who stored grievances, because grievances required a certain faith that the alternative was possible, and she had spent too long working in probability to believe that what had happened could have happened differently and still arrived at the same place. But she thought about it. She catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, carefully, with an eye for pattern. The pattern she found was this: the world had almost answered with fear. It had almost answered with weapons. Not because the people wielding those weapons were bad people. Most of them were not in any simple sense, not in any sense she was comfortable dismissing. They were frightened people, which was different. They had spent decades thinking about what contact would look like, what it had to look like, given the logic of a species that had spent its entire history treating the unknown as a threat, and what they had prepared for was not what arrived. What arrived was patience. The military assets that scrambled toward the outer solar system found nothing to engage. The mothers had been, by the time those assets arrived, already in ongoing communication with Mara's group, already deep into the slow, careful work of building a shared grammar, already showing evidence of the specific care that a very old intelligence shows when it has decided that this particular encounter is going to go well. There was nothing to threaten. There was nothing that responded to threat. The ship simply continued its patient approach, adjusting its trajectory with the unhurried ease of something that had been moving through space for a very long time, and had no particular anxiety about the duration of the remaining journey. The generals and the analysts and the threat assessment teams built their models and ran their scenarios and concluded, eventually, reluctantly, with the specific reluctance of people whose entire professional architecture was built on the assumption of adversarial contact, that what they were dealing with was not adversarial, that the contact model they'd been trained for was not the contact model in play. Mara was asked to brief them. She did it 4 times to 4 different groups at 4 different levels of classification. She told the same story each time, 2 in the morning, a mirror, a knock, come in. She watched the same discomfort cross 4 different groups of faces. The discomfort of powerful people being told that the most significant event in human history had been initiated not by a protocol or a committee or a carefully prepared response team, but by a single insomniac who happened to be listening at the right moment. The 4th time, a general, older, sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had survived his career by always understanding what he could and could not control, waited until the others had filed out and said to her, quietly, "What if you'd been the wrong person?" Mara had thought about this. "I think they would have kept knocking," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's terrifying." "No," she said, "I think that's the point. It means they weren't relying on the right person. They were relying on eventually someone, which is a much better bet." He nodded slowly, without quite agreeing, which was the most she expected from a man whose profession required him to believe that the right person at the right moment was the only thing standing between order and catastrophe. She understood his perspective. She didn't share it. What the mothers had demonstrated, across 2 years of patient knocking and the months of careful communication that followed, was something that a threat assessment framework was not built to absorb, that the universe contained things that were not interested in catastrophe, things that had had their catastrophes long ago and learned from them and built something different, things that arrived with open hands and waited as long as it took for someone to open the door. That was not naivety on their part. Mara was clear about this in every briefing. The mothers were not naive. They were, by any measure available to human analysis, orders of magnitude beyond human civilization in both age and capability. They could have made themselves unmissable. They could have landed in Times Square or hovered over the capital cities of the world and made the question of their existence non-optional. They had chosen not to because they had learned. At cost, she was more certain of this as the communication deepened. That entrance by force, even force of presence, even the overwhelming force of undeniable visible existence, soured the exchange that followed. It created a dynamic of power and response rather than recognition and reciprocity. And the record they kept was a record of mutual recognition, not of encounters where one party had been overwhelmed into acknowledging the other. They wanted to be chosen, not submitted to, chosen. That was the difference, and it was everything. The children understood it first, as they often do. Within a week of the public disclosure, schools around the world were doing projects. Not as some had feared, as some school boards had debated, traumatic or destabilizing projects, not emergency preparedness exercises or existential anxiety workshops. Projects about the record, projects about what to put in it. Children drawing and writing and composing and making videos, and recording themselves saying things in their own languages that they wanted the mothers to know about humans. A class in Osaka sent a collection of paper crane instructions. Not the cranes themselves, just the instructions, which they argued was better because the instructions were something you could give anyone and they could make it themselves, which was more generous than just giving the object. A class in Cape Town recorded a performance of a song they'd written together about the smell of rain on dry ground, because they'd decided that smell was something the mothers probably didn't have a word for yet, and that it was important. A boy in Manila, 8 years old, sent a written message that had been translated into every language the contact team could manage, which read, "We are sorry for not answering sooner. We were not ignoring you. We just did not know we were supposed to be listening." Mara read that 3 times. Ben, who was coordinating the children's contributions by this point, it had become, without planning or announcement, simply his job, told her about a class in Stockholm that had spent 2 weeks debating what the most important thing about humans was, what the one thing they would most want an alien species to know, and had concluded, after extended and apparently quite heated discussion, that it was impermanence, the fact that humans died, that they knew they would die, that they made things and loved people, and built entire civilizations with the full knowledge that none of it would last forever, and did it anyway. "That's the thing," Mara said. They argued about it. They wrote papers. One kid wanted it to be music, another one wanted it to be dogs. There was a faction, apparently, very passionate about dogs. Ben smiled. But the plurality came down to impermanence. They thought it was the most distinctly human thing, that we know we're temporary and we choose to care anyway. Mara thought about this for a while. Did the mothers respond to that? Ben nodded. He pulled up the mirror record, the logs they'd been keeping since the communication began, the structured record of exchange. He found a section she hadn't seen yet and showed her. The mothers had not responded in words or images. They had responded in the way they usually responded to the things that moved them. They had added it to the record, not as a fact about humans, as an entry in a category she had not seen before in the record structure, a category that the translation framework rendered as something like the specific courage of the finite. It was a large category. It had many entries. Every species the mothers had ever met was temporary in the cosmic reckoning of things. Every intelligence was finite. Every civilization had its arc, but not all of them had known it consciously and made things anyway. Not all of them had named the impermanence and held it alongside the making and refused to let one cancel the other. The ones that had were, apparently, the ones the mothers found most worth carrying. Mara sat with that for a long time. She thought about Harry Owen in the short film she'd been watching the night before the first knock, an old favorite, something she returned to when the insomnia was bad, a 13-minute thing about a man who sees something in his bathroom mirror that challenges everything he thinks is real. She'd been watching it, half asleep in her desk chair, when the first resonance hit. She had never been able to decide afterward whether that was coincidence or something else. Whether the mothers had been watching too, in some sense, aware of what she had on her screen, drawn toward the specific poignancy of a man standing in front of a mirror at 2 in the morning asking whether any of it was real. Did you ever get the feeling, the character had said, that there's nothing to your life, that everything's the same day in, day out? She had felt that. She had felt it deeply, in the specific way of someone doing solitary, precise work in the dark, looking for signals that might not be there, building a life out of the disciplined refusal to conclude that the static was just static. And then something had knocked. And the static had resolved into signal, and the signal had said, "You are not nothing. You are not the same. Every day is recorded. Every day is kept. Every day is added to the weight of what has existed in this universe, and will not be forgotten." She did not know if that was what the mothers had intended to communicate. She was not sure, even now, that she hadn't projected her own particular need onto what was, at its core, a practical archival exchange between species. But she knew what she had received, and she knew that the children in Stockholm had received something similar, each in their own terms. And she knew that the man in Cape Town who had recorded the smell of rain had received it, and the boy in Manila who had apologized for not listening sooner. The record did not require a specific emotion. It did not mandate a particular response to being known, but being known, it turned out, did something to people. Being told not in words, not in any language that could be summarized or abbreviated, but in the full 4-hour, undeniable physical weight of the mirror opened wide, being told that you existed, that your existence had been witnessed, that it would be carried forward past your own capacity to carry it. That did something. It did something she could not name precisely and would spend the rest of her life trying to describe. She wrote about it. She wrote about it constantly, in the years after, in papers and essays, and eventually a book that spent 4 months on bestseller lists, and that she was never quite satisfied with, because the thing she was trying to describe always seemed to be one layer deeper than the layer she'd managed to reach. She kept writing because writing was how she thought, and she kept thinking about it because it was the most important thing she had ever encountered. The closest she ever got was this: the universe is full of intelligence. It is full of things that have learned to think and speak and love and lose. And most of those things, at some point in their history, looked out at the vast dark and felt the specific loneliness of a species that cannot yet see what else is out there, that knows, abstractly, that the stars are many, but has not yet been given the visceral knowledge that those stars are not empty, that the darkness is not silent, that the patience moving through the void is not nothing. The mothers had been doing this for 17,000 years, gathering and carrying and offering, planet by patient planet, system by system, the record that said, here is everyone. Here is everything that has thought and felt and made and lost and carried on. Here is the proof that it is not lonely out here. They had been doing it long enough to know that some doors opened quickly and some opened slowly and some, perhaps, did not open in any given generation. They had been doing it long enough to have been patient for 2 years and to have kept their knock small and to have waited for someone who was listening. Someone had been listening. The signal had been there all along, patient in the static, waiting to be found by someone who had trained herself to find things. Mara Voss had found it the way she found every signal, not because she was looking for that specific thing, but because she had learned, through years of discipline and sleepless practice, not to dismiss the anomaly, not to call the unfamiliar noise until she had heard it completely. She had heard it completely, she had recognized the pattern, she had said, come in. And the universe had come in. It had brought everything with it, the 17,000 years and the star count of species, and the weight of all the impermanent, finite, courageous things that had ever made something knowing they would not live to see the end of it. It had brought all of that, and set it down gently in the cold tiled bathroom of a tired signal analyst who hadn't mopped in a week, and asked nothing in return except the same thing it had always asked, the only currency it had ever traded in. That we carry it forward, that we add our part to the record, that we join the long and patient work of being known. Mara Voss had said, come in. And that in the end was the whole story. That was the only story, the one that had been waiting for 2 years for someone to answer the door. She mopped the bathroom eventually. She thought it was the right thing to do.